is the great equalizer, the one thing that all have in common, and the destroyer of worlds. Death is something all of us have to deal with, so it should be no surprise that we have eventually started creating personifications of death. By studying each culture's personifications of death, we can acquire key insights into the inner workings of that culture and how they deal with tragedy. By now we should all be familiar with the Grim Reaper, who is everywhere in pop culture today, and in fact, a group of scientists in Sydney, Australia tried to figure out how fast the Grim Reaper could walk by measuring the speed of 1,705 70-year-old or older men. The study is kind of BS because they found that guys who walk faster at that age die faster, and they tried to pull some shenanigans about death not liking people who walk fast. I just thought the study was weird and wanted to tell people about it. It doesn't really have anything to do with anything. Now, while the Grim Reaper may be commonplace, it isn't really all that old as far as depictions of death are concerned. It only came around during the second bubonic plague pandemic, which is the big one. Now, the oldest known civilization is Sumer or Sumeria. Regardless, it's in ancient Mesopotamia around 5,500 years ago, and now their depiction of death was the goddess Ereshkigal, whose name translates as
Queen of the Great Below,
or
Lady of the Great Place.
Oh yeah, and it's also important to note that in this context, great referred to as size, not like special or exemplary. The underworld in this depiction is actually given a physical location. It is distinctly located below the mountains of Sunset to the west, which should be easy enough to find by looking at a topographical map of the Middle East, but the only mountain ranges to the west are in modern-day Arabia. But if Jeremy Black and Anthony Green are to be believed in their book, Gods, Demons, and Symbols of Ancient Mesopotamia, then it is under the Zagros mountain, because Ker at the start of the underworld's name, Kernugia, means mountain. And now here's the thing about Mount Zagros. It's currently to the east of where the Sumerian civilization was. Now, this could be because geology, things have a tendency to move from place to place and slowly shift over time, or it could be because the authors just picked the nearest mountain. Yeah. Alright, so in ancient Sumeria, there was more than one death god. This is something that is fairly present in many myths personifying death. Like in ancient Greece, you had Thanos, Hades, and Persephone. And then in Nordic mythology, you have like Odin and Hel, the keepers of the honorable dead and dishonorable dead, respectively. And so in ancient Sumeria, you of course have Ereshkigal, who was in charge of the goings-on of the people in the underworld, things like making sure they had enough sand to eat and mud to drink, and to make sure nobody escaped, they had Neti watching the Seven Gates. And later on, Nergal, Neti's boyfriend, started co-gatekeeping because he was very supportive of her job and wanted to help out and make sure she succeeded as much as possible. That is how I'm choosing to interpret that. There was also Eshkirgal's niece, Nungal, whose job was to punish the wicked. I assume it was her job to make sure they don't get any delicious sand to eat. As I've been making jokes about, the Sumerian afterlife is not a great place to go to. All there is to eat and drink is dust and mud, and that is for the good people. Nungal, whose domains are healing and retribution, seem to have been a type of justice god rather than a divine torturer, which makes me kind of imagine her as this like plucky young niece of the goddess of death, whose aunt just gave her a job as a good starting place for her career, rather than somebody who was really into BDSM. If you've been paying attention to my diction, you would have noticed that for most of these gods, I've been using feminine nouns to refer to them, which may come off as a bit of a shock, because in modern times, or at least modern English-speaking times, death is normally identified as a man or a masculine thing. It's why we die first. To those of us who grew up watching Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, well, that show is probably why, but even before 2000, when the show premiered, people thought of death as a masculine thing. Yeah, so take for example one study done in 1988 and 1989, which found that death was perceived as a more masculine thing. So now I ask, why the shift? Like back over 5,000 years ago, death was personified mostly by women. I mean, there was that one guy, he was just sort of support. And then more recently, or at least more popularly, there's the Norse personification of death. And when people die honorably in battle, like the Valkyries, one of the most famous or iconic depictions of a shepherd of death, they would swoop in and carry their souls off to Valhalla. And then, of course, like the normal people who died would go to Helheim, where Hel or Hela is in charge of them. So yeah, very heavy feminine present there. But today, like the most popular personification of death is probably the Grim Reaper. Why is that? Now, Weller, Florian, and Tenenbaum, the people who did the study I mentioned earlier, they tried to figure out why, and what they basically did was they tallied up all the traits that death was supposed to have, and it just kind of found that like most of the traits that death was supposed to have happened to have like masculine connotations or somehow. Anyways, there was probably a massive confound in the study, and that is the language used. So as a book by Carl S. Gerthik points out, it's the book of gender of death. The gender of a personification of death is very language dependent. So here in America, death may be a mysterious hooded figure with a scythe, but south of the border in Mexico, death is the nice Aunt Sebastiana. And now, when Gerthik analyzed why language will pick a gender of death, he basically just says personifying death is just something people do, and to figure out why each depiction is the way it is dependent on each individual person who makes a depiction of death. For example, the Grim Reaper came about in a place where the majority of people were farmers, so scythes, which started out as a farming tool, would be pretty commonplace. Beyond that, when a person dies,
and their skin is slowly dried out and stretched tight till it's pulled apart, your muscles slowly rotting and decay, and then the bacteria in your organs decide to feast on the organ they once called home, like Hansel and Gretel in the witch's candy home. All the while worms, bugs, and everything else that makes your skin crawl rip apart your body into fleshy shreds for them to sustain themselves for only a brief glimmer of time before they themselves are put to the same fate, eventually revealing only a skeleton.
Which is where they get that aspect from. Finally, hooded figures in dark cloaks are creepy, which is why the Grim Reaper is dressed that way. And for a much quicker example, let's look at Neil Gaiman, who wrote The Sandman, was just really into goth chicks. Now, the reason why the study of death is important is because we will all die one day,
and there's nothing you or anyone else can do. Death is a cosmic certainty, which nothing can escape no matter how much you pray or try to resist. The end is coming for you and your dog. Your tiny lives are unimportant and will be consumed by the nothingness that is death. So the only thing you can do with your worthless lives is to submit to the nothing.
Sorry, I blacked out there for a second. Anyway, death is important because it is the most unique thing that one can do. Sure, everybody dies, but each person's individual death is something only they will go through. The only point in your life that is going to be uniquely your own is your death.